Welcome to another episode of The Advocate. Today my guests are very experienced, very knowledgeable people with regard to our topic, and today we're going to be talking about Pueblo land grants. For me, it's kind of a new and interesting topic. I was not aware of Pueblo land grants even existing before I started reading the book that you gentlemen published. It's called Four Square Leagues, and it's out now. And so we have Malcolm Ebright, who is the Director of Land Grant Studies. We have Rick Hendricks, who is the State Historian. And then we also have Richard Hughes, who's an attorney in Santa Fe. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. Appreciate you being down here.
Thank you.
Rick, as a State Historian, tell us a little bit about the book first. How did that come about?
Well, this book has a long history. It began with some research that I was doing for an Indian Pueblo in the El Paso area, actually. And one of the tasks that was assigned to me was to write a history of the concept of the Pueblo League, the Four Square League grants. I had met Malcolm not too much before that, and I asked the firm if we could bring him in, and we began to work on it together. And then Malcolm and I were actually working for Richard on some of his cases, and I'll let Richard tell the story of how he got involved in the project, but it is a project that's been going on probably close to 20 years.
Okay, and Malcolm, you're the Director of Land Grant Studies in New Mexico, so it's fairly obvious why you're interested and involved in this, but tell us a little bit about the book itself.
Well, we could start with Four Square Leagues. That's a question that people ask, why Four Square Leagues? And the Pueblos, no one really quite knew where the concept, right now if you look at a map, which we have in the book, of what the Pueblo lands, you find squares, which turn out to be, for Four Square Leagues, it's about 17,350 acres. And it was thought maybe there was a law that prescribed Four Square Leagues being the amount that a Pueblo would get. And we did a lot of research and discovered that it mainly developed out of cases in which Spaniards would ask for a grant bounded by a Pueblo, bounded by, let's say, Poaqui Pueblo, but not knowing where that boundary was. And so as they began in the early 1700s, the Pueblos had lawyers that represented them, more or less like legal aid now, called protectores de indios. And the protector de indios of a Pueblo would say, well, we need to measure the 4 square leagues of this Pueblo, and that's where the boundary that you're going to butt to. So they used these cordels, and it was 5,000 vars in each direction from the center of the Pueblo, and that was the 4 Square Leagues.
So that's how the title came about, and we're going to get into the details here in just a bit, okay? But I want to go to Richard, and Richard, tell me, how are you involved in all of this? You're an attorney in Santa Fe, and Rick said something about a case or cases that you deal with, so I assume that there was some litigation involving this.
Lots of Pueblo land litigation. That's been pretty much my specialty for a long time, longer than I care to admit, to be honest. In a very important land case, I did retain Rick when he was still a professor at NMSU and Malcolm as experts to work with a group of old Spanish documents that one of my client tribes had assembled over a period of time, going back 300 years actually, which documented that tribe's acquisition of parcels of land north of Bernalillo, and it's actually, all this is laid out in chapter 2 of the book concerning Santa Anna's purchase of its El Ranchito lands. And this was all, these documents had been in a shoebox in somebody's closet for a long time. And
kind of the way we all store our documents, right?
Exactly. We've, since that time, and Malcolm and Rick did marvelous translations of the documents and transcriptions. We've had the documents all copied professionally, and I should say that in the course of preparing this book, the Tribal Council agreed to place the documents on long-term loan at the New Mexico State Record Center and Archives, so they'll be available for scholarly study, which is was a great move on their part. But Anyway, so Malcolm and Rick and I were, of course, met periodically, and they were telling me about this book that they were working on concerning Pueblo lands, and of course focusing on the Pueblo League and its origin, which, as Malcolm said, is really still sort of mysterious. There's no real clear indication of where or how that concept originated. But one thing I brought up in the course of our conversations was to ask them if they were going to be including a section on the Cruzati grants, which are, as anyone who reads the book, are fairly fundamental in studying about Pueblo lands. And they said, well, no, we hadn't really planned on doing that. And I said, oh, come on, guys, you can't write a book about Pueblo land without a chapter on the Cruzati grants. And so Rick said to me, well, why don't you write it? And as I have mentioned in the past, it was one of those moments that looking back years later, I thought maybe I should have given that a little more thought before I blurted out an answer. But actually, it turned out to be a great experience to work with these two. I mean, they're obviously the historians, the professionals, and I'm just the lawyer. But it was a chance to really study the subject of these Cruzati grants, which are actually confirmed Pueblo land grants, but I mean actual Spanish documents. But historians all agree that they're all now not authentic. They were all fakes created in the mid-18th century, or no, 19th century, pardon me. But I also then was able to contribute some additional work to the book, mainly concerning the status of the Pueblos during the American period, which is also extremely important, very complicated, and very confusing, and really has sort of led the Pueblos to where they are today. But anyway, it's been a great experience to work with these guys.
Well, it's a wonderful book. It's a wealth of information, wealth of knowledge, historical perspective with regard to all of these land grants. If somebody's interested in getting a copy of the book, Malcolm, where could they get a copy of this? It's Foursquare Leagues.
There's two places. One would be UNM Press and bookstores. And the Center for Language Studies has a website, southwestbooks.org, and we have it on our website as well.
SW-Books.org.
No, that's
is it Southwest?
That's a different.
That's your
Southwest.
Okay.
That's my email.
Sorry.
southwestbooks.org.
Okay, so everybody knows where to get a copy of the book, and it's worth the read if you're interested in history at all. You know, I think the thing that I guess that I had questions about initially, Pueblo land grants. How is it that if the Spanish that first came to this part of the world didn't own any land, and the Native Americans were already here and presumably owned all of the land, how is it that you would even have a Pueblo land grant? How does something like that even occur?
Well, I suppose that's one of the questions. You know, why is it that it came about? But I think it really goes to the idea of the Spanish concept of property and land ownership, and the notion that land needs to be demarcated, boundaries need to be established, documents need to be created to establish ownership so that it can then be bought and sold. Those kinds of European ideas, that's part of what is transferred. We talk about the Spanish civilization coming to this part of the world, and that's part of it, that legalistic way of looking at land. Prior to the arrival of the Spaniards, you can imagine that Pueblo communities would have had concepts of what was their land, and the boundaries would have been natural features, a river, a mountain. There also would have been areas where they would have shared, for example, areas where they hunted, and maybe at certain times of the year one group hunted or something. We don't really know the mechanism, but they would have had their own concept. And I think that we would all agree one of the most interesting things that came out of this study was how readily they adapted to the Spanish system.
And by they, you're referring to the Native
the
Americans?
Pueblos
Okay,
adapted to the European concept of land ownership. And in the documents that Richard was referring to, one of the things that's really remarkable is the idea of the Pueblos purchasing additional land. That's something that, for most of us Spanish colonial historians, wouldn't really have thought that had happened, and it's very well documented in these documents that they were also purchasing land, and of course they became as litigious as the rest of Spanish society.
I noticed that. I want, and that's a pretty interesting point, especially from a lawyer's standpoint. Sure. And so I want to get to that in just a moment. But let's go back a little bit. Malcolm, you had talked about 4 square leagues, and I guess in your studies, in your research, you're trying to figure out where in the world that requirement or that limitation came from. Was it something in Spanish law? Was it something somewhere else? How in the world, why is it that the Spanish government actually would recognize that the Pueblos were entitled to that amount of space?
Well, I think there was a provision in Central America and around Mexico City and the indigenous tribes down there. They would allot a certain amount of land, but it wasn't the same amount, and it was also a matter of practice more than it was a written law. But they would have a amount of land beyond which the Spaniards were not supposed to encroach. And as we looked at the documents, it seemed like it came out of the blue, really. They just started measuring, and you can see who it was. It was during the time of Diego de Vargas was governor, right near the end of his second term, I guess. These alcaldes that were acting as the protector de indios just said, we're going to measure 5,000 varas. And it's the way sometimes things develop. Rather than being a law, it just became, you might call it custom, but it's not a favorite term
practice.
These days. Yes, yeah. And later on, they would say the 4 square leagues to which the sovereign entitles us, or as if it was written down. So it became a matter of custom, and they would always do it.
And why did the Spaniards do it? Was it a sense of fairness? Was it just trying to recognize that there were other individuals here before they got here, and so in order to be fair or to be righteous in some way?
Well, it's very important to remember, and really this concept actually originated with Spanish theologians and judicial officials and philosophers in the 16th and 17th centuries. The concept that the Aboriginal inhabitants of the New World were not savages who could be simply disregarded and pushed aside, but were souls that could be saved. And that, the acceptance of that concept by the Spanish crown meant that the property rights of the natives also had to be respected. And one important point that is undoubtedly critical to understanding where the Pueblo League came from. Again, there's this fundamental notion among the Spaniards that these people do have property rights, and those must be respected. And in fact, the Spanish, like the United States, recognized that the government had a special relationship with the Pueblo communities, at least, a guardianship concept in a sense, although they didn't typically use that term. And so there were, as Malcolm explained, there was a Spanish official known as the Protector de las Indias, whose duty it was to advocate on behalf of the Pueblos. But the point I was going to make is that in 1680, as we all know, the Pueblos revolted. It was probably the only truly successful Indian revolt in North America that occurred after the arrival of the Europeans. Drove the Spaniards out of the territory entirely, and they stayed out for 12 years, holed up in El Paso. They made occasional sorties back into the territory, but basically the Indians threw the Spaniards out. And during that time, all of the documents that had pertained to the Spanish administration prior to 1680 were destroyed. They were, of course, in the Palace of the Governors. The Pueblos occupied the building and essentially destroyed the documents. It is very possible that those documents would have given us a much better idea of the origin of this concept, but there's hardly anything left. There's really just a handful of documents from the pre-1680 period that are extant and that we have access to. But the fundamental notion of the Spaniards having this very highly developed relationship of a special relationship with the Pueblos meant that they took very seriously the notion of trying to avoid encroachments on Pueblo land, and admittedly, the seriousness and assiduousness of that view varied from one governor to the next. But you see instances in which governors are very protective of the Pueblos' lands and will actually take steps to move the Spaniards off of land that they might have settled on if they find that there is encroachment.
Yeah, and I think that's the nice historical perspective of this book is you see kind of almost dependent on the whim of the governor that was in charge of the territory at the time. You see some situations where the Native Americans' rights are being protected, and if anybody happened to encroach on that property, that efforts were made to at least determine what the boundaries were and then to correct those types of issues. Another particular interesting point that I saw was, you see several lawsuits and several petitions to the governor by the Native Americans, by different Pueblos, requesting land or requesting that their boundaries be respected. That's contrary to the impression that most of us have of the Wild West. If you go back to the 1800s, it really is vastly different. That kind of more methodical, legal or legalistic way of trying to resolve these land disputes than what we typically would think of in the Wild West. How is it just? Are we not getting a clear picture initially? What's really going on there?
Well, I mean, the Spanish government was a very legalistic operation, and that was transferred. I think that we've made the point here that there were protections provided by the Spanish crown and by governors and by protectores de indios, but I think it's no less significant that the Pueblos themselves were advocating for their own rights. I think very early on they understood that, and I think we have several cases that we trace where Pueblo delegations travel south. They travel to Guadalajara, they travel to Durango, and they travel to Mexico City pursuing appeals. And we don't really have examples of that from Hispanos typically, not to say that they didn't defend their rights, but pursuing the legal avenues that were open to them. It's really quite remarkable, and generally speaking, the Pueblos were very successful in pursuing those appeals. So yes, a very legalistic society, and I would say that this is an area that has not really been looked at that much. How did the Native Americans adapt to the Spanish legal system? And it's a little bit different from the Wild West. The Billy the Kid, that
perception
type of
that we're
thing.
left with, sure.
Yeah, I think it was a different society.
Well, and even in the book, I had noticed that many of the Pueblos purchased land. They wanted to increase their land holdings, particularly in the areas that they were already occupying property, and then so they purchased land that bounded them. And you wouldn't typically think of the Old West in a situation where Native Americans were actually negotiating the purchase of land. How do you address that kind of, I guess, difference in perception?
I think we looked for the problem of writing a book about Pueblos basically from the standpoint of the Spaniards through Spaniards' documents is that you're not getting the Pueblo voice. But in terms of their purchasing land, often we were getting the Pueblo voice. Some of the petitions were actually drafted by the Pueblo Indians, and I think they learned really quickly. They were very flexible. So maybe 20 years after the Pueblo Revolt, when the concept of buying land was not part of their worldview, they were buying land, and they saw that, well, the Spaniards recognize a piece of paper, and if we have that piece of paper, they won't mess with us. Let's figure out how to do it. And so they were, some of these descriptions of how they would use cattle, mainly sheep, and and the purchase price, often they would have an appraisal and all, and then they would usually a pretty good substantial amount. And in the Santa Ana Pueblo in particular, those documents, they go for a period of maybe 50, 60 years, and the Pueblos not only are buying land, but they're realizing that the Spaniards are actually playing games with them to some extent. Sometimes the same brother of a person will say, well, actually, that was my land that you bought, so now you have to buy it from me. And they say, okay, we'll buy it. But eventually they bought everybody that claimed the land, and then they not only own it, but the Court of Private Land Claims confirmed the Ranchito grant to Santa Ana Pueblo.
Well, so a lot of interesting things in the book too. I mean, how they determined the distance, because they didn't have GPS obviously back then, and they didn't have the sophisticated surveying skills and tools, the technology that we have available today. But they were still very industrious. I found it particularly interesting how they would actually measure. Tell us a little bit about that, Richard.
The measurement of the league was quite an operation, and as Rick and Malcolm have explained, that typically arose when a Spaniard was seeking a grant that was adjacent to a pueblo, or there was a complaint that the pueblo that a Spanish family might be encroaching on pueblo land, and so virtually every response would be that the pueblo would request that its league be measured, and the governor would sometimes appoint officials. The local official, the alcalde, would come out. There would be a whole delegation. The representatives of the pueblo would be there, of the Hispanic settlers. There'd be officials who would. They had this cordell, a long cord which was preferably made of horsehair. But often the things broke and they had to be replaced. They don't have
and
leather.
the horsehair, because they didn't want it to stretch or shrink, right?
Exactly.
I mean, that's why made of horsehair.
But frequently you'd find that there were big sections that were leather, and those would have to be wetted or waxed or treated in some way to try to avoid stretching or allow stretching, depending on which side you were on, of course. And those cordels were typically either 50 or 100 varas in length. Now, a vara is 33 inches, not just a little less than a yard. So they're pretty substantially, they're long cords. And one official holds one end, another marches off with a compass in the direction, and understanding that a league was defined as a square centered usually on the steps of the mission church in the middle of the pueblo, and each side is 1 league, which is 5,000 Spanish varas, about 2.6 miles in each direction from the steps. So you have a square that's about 5.2 miles on a side, oriented with the cardinal directions. But to measure the league, again, one guy stands at the starting point, the other guy takes the cordell till it's stretched tight. The next guy then walks up past him, same direction till it's stretched tight, and they keep going. With 100 vara cordell, you've got to go 50 lengths.
Well, that's great if everything's flat. But what happens when you have the terrain here in New Mexico? And
occasionally, it was an excruciating and very difficult process. And so typically we find that when the same league is measured at different times, there'll be not widely differing measurements, but significantly different measurements. Actually, we document 3 measurements of the San Ildefonso and Santa Clara leagues that actually came up with, over a period of, 40 or 50 years, the differences in measurements were about 3%, which it's a surprisingly small difference given the crude technique that was used. So they obviously did.
So a 3% margin of error.
3% margin of error, which is, again, isn't too bad for that kind of a length. And but then they would, when the league had been measured, the official would usually direct that some sort of monument be erected. Actually, the cover of the book shows the cordell here and this pile of stones, which represents the monument. And often they would direct, because people will try to remove the stones if they want the monument to disappear.
Well, and apparently that happened on several occasions, because you look at the historical timeline and you notice that there are same measurements for same pueblos over a period of 60, maybe 80, 100 years, where the monuments had been removed, and they had to go through that process then again of trying to reclaim their land. So that pretty much about how
well, and of
in
course,
some instances.
I mean, sometimes they were nice monuments as in the illustration, but also a body of water could be a monument, or sometimes a tree stump. There are various different things that are referenced in documents. And of course, sometimes, I mean, certainly here in the Southwest, to have a water course is kind of a dicey proposition, because sometimes
it changes
they
course.
change.
Yeah, eventually it'll change course.
So yeah, I mean, there's quite a bit of that, and we have evidence of cases where, in the course of dealing with this encroachment issue, there would be the idea that perhaps, in addition to the above ground one, there had been one buried, so that in case it got moved, which it often did, you could go back and say, well, okay, well, here's where it was originally under the ground. So.
I'm sorry we have such a short amount of time, but thank you for being here. We appreciate it. And as always, know your rights, know your responsibilities, and God bless.